On the morning of September 21st, 1996, the town of Belgrade, Montana, was buzzing with excitement. It was the day of the annual town festival, a community favorite filled with music, performances, and neighbors gathering to enjoy the crisp autumn air together. 15-year-old Danielle Houchin had plans to meet up with friends later in the evening, but with a few free hours beforehand, she decided to take advantage of the beautiful weather and go for a walk. The trail she chose ran alongside a river just outside of town, one she knew well. Before leaving, her mother asked her to be back by 2 p.m. and handed Danielle her own wristwatch. Danielle didn't have one yet, and her mom wanted to make sure she'd return on time. Danielle grabbed a bottle of water, promised to be back before the guests arrived, and left the house around 11:30 a.m. When 2 p.m. came and went with no sign of her, her mother began to worry. At first, she assumed Danielle had simply lost track of time, but the unease grew. With guests expected at the house and no word from her daughter, she grabbed a friend and headed to the trailhead. As they pulled into the parking lot, the sight of Danielle's white pickup truck immediately set off alarm bells. Even though she was underage and technically not allowed to drive without an adult, Danielle's parents sometimes let her use the truck around town. It was a quiet place, and she'd already proven to be a capable driver. But now, the truck sat there, doors unlocked, no sign of Danielle. Her mom and friends started down the path toward the river, calling out her name. They didn't get far before spotting Danielle's water bottle and car keys lying on the ground. Panic set in. Something was clearly wrong. Without wasting another moment, her mother rushed to contact the authorities. At first, Danielle's mother thought her daughter might have slipped down a slope or suffered an accident somewhere along the trail. Without a cell phone to call for help, she jumped in her car and drove straight to the police station. About an hour later, search teams began arriving at the trailhead. Rescue crews scoured the area, working methodically along the path, through the surrounding woods, and along the riverbank. But there was no sign of Danielle. As night fell and temperatures dropped to near freezing, the official search was paused until morning. Danielle's family, though, couldn't bring themselves to stop. Refusing to go home, they kept searching through the night. Friends and neighbors joined in, forming small groups and spreading out across the wooded terrain to cover as much ground as possible. One of those groups included a man and his 2 sons, close friends of Danielle's younger sister. The 3 of them headed into the forested area near the river, flashlights in hand. Just a few hundred yards from the parking lot, something in the water caught their eye. They moved closer and aimed their lights toward the river's edge. What they saw stopped them cold. Danielle's body was lying in the shallows, barely submerged in a few feet of water near the shore. The man knew immediately she was gone. He sprinted back to his car and drove off to report what he had found. On the way, he ran into Danielle's father and delivered the devastating news himself. Police soon arrived at the scene and took control of the area. Danielle's body was sent to medical examiners for a full evaluation, though it would take several days for the results. In the meantime, the county sheriff made a public statement. It looked like a tragic accident. There were no obvious injuries, no clear signs of foul play, and the initial assumption was that Danielle had somehow slipped and drowned. Her family was heartbroken and deeply skeptical. Danielle had grown up in the outdoors. She knew the trail, knew the river, and was anything but careless in nature. Her parents couldn't make sense of how someone with her experience could drown in such shallow water. Still, despite their concerns, the sheriff stood by his statement and declined to open a formal investigation. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your support means a lot to us and helps us grow. A huge thank you to everyone who's been watching. Everything shifted when the medical examiner's report finally came in. Danielle's body, it turned out, told a very different story from what the sheriff had initially suggested. The examiners documented multiple bruises and scratches, injuries that looked like defensive wounds. It appeared Danielle had fought back. They also noted her underwear had been pulled down, raising immediate red flags. The findings made it increasingly difficult to believe this was just an accident. Further examination revealed something even more disturbing. Danielle had been sexually assaulted. Forensic analysts found a biological sample on her underwear, belonging to an unknown male. While the cause of death was confirmed to be drowning, the circumstances suggested something far more sinister. The pathologists believed someone had likely held Danielle underwater. They also noticed a curious detail. Her mother's wristwatch, which Danielle had been wearing when she left that morning, had slid up to her elbow. The examiners theorized that she may have been dragged by the arms, and the watch had shifted as she was pulled toward the river. Despite these troubling details, the official manner of death was still listed as undetermined. The examiners agreed Danielle had drowned, and they strongly suspected foul play, but they couldn't gather enough conclusive evidence to legally classify it as a homicide. As a result, authorities didn't open a full criminal investigation. Police maintained their position. They didn't yet know what had really happened to Danielle. Still, they didn't completely close the case. Investigators pressed on, hoping to uncover more information. Forensic experts continued analyzing the evidence and found 4 hairs on Danielle's underwear, again from an unidentified male. The hairs appeared to be from an arm, and a partial DNA profile was successfully extracted. But at the time, the FBI's national DNA database hadn't been established, so there was no way to match it to anyone. One thing was clear: both the semen and the hairs belonged to the same person. Investigators returned to the riverbank where Danielle's body had been found and discovered a single man's boot print in the dirt. It was unclear whether it was connected to the case, but they documented it and started questioning people who might be linked. Unfortunately, with only a partial DNA sample to work from, they couldn't even attempt a comparison. None of the suspects they interviewed could be definitively tied to the crime scene. What many people didn't realize at the time, perhaps most disturbingly, was that significant details about Danielle's case had been kept from the public. Even her own family had been left in the dark. For a long time, they didn't know that Danielle had been sexually assaulted. From their perspective, it simply looked like the police were still trying to piece things together. Despite the sheriff's insistence that her death was accidental or unclear, some officers quietly questioned why the case hadn't been reclassified as a homicide and investigated more aggressively. Among those officers was Cindy Botek. She had only recently joined the police force, just days before Danielle's disappearance, but she became involved in the investigation almost immediately. From the start, Botek believed they were looking at a murder. Still new to the department, she didn't have the authority to challenge her superiors or push for a deeper probe. All she could do was take part in the limited work that was allowed and keep wondering what really happened that afternoon by the river. One theory she considered was that Danielle may have known her attacker, someone from town, possibly a neighbor or even a friend. Botek spoke with Danielle's parents, hoping for any clue, but they couldn't think of anyone who might want to hurt their daughter. Danielle had no known conflicts with classmates, no enemies in the community. Nothing stood out. In the months following her death, the case stalled. Police continued interviewing people, considering possible suspects, but with no formal homicide investigation underway, progress was minimal. The lack of momentum was deeply frustrating to several officers, including Botek, who couldn't understand why the case wasn't being treated more seriously. To them, it was clear. Danielle had been attacked. And if no one was looking for the person who did it, then there was a good chance that person was still living quietly among them. A few years after Danielle's death, investigators tried again to push the case forward. They submitted the partial DNA sample recovered from her body to the FBI's database, hoping advances in technology or newly added profiles might produce a match. But once again, nothing came back. In the time since Danielle's murder, her family had slowly begun to uncover more of the truth, details that had never been shared with them in the early days of the investigation. It was only later that they learned she had been sexually assaulted. The revelation was devastating, not just because of the horror of what had happened, but because it confirmed their worst fear. The sheriff had failed them. From day one, he had declined to treat the case as a homicide, and worse, he had withheld crucial information from the family. Years later, the sheriff changed his tune. He claimed he had always believed Danielle had been murdered, but this directly contradicted his public statements to local media at the time of her death, where he clearly said there wasn't enough evidence to classify it as a homicide. Danielle's parents remembered him saying the same thing to them in private, which only deepened their sense of betrayal. In his defense, the sheriff tried to shift the blame to the medical examiners, arguing that their classification of the manner of death as undetermined had prevented him from launching a full investigation. But for Danielle's family, that explanation rang hollow. They believed the sheriff was simply trying to dodge responsibility. Everyone knew that the early days after a murder are critical, and in Danielle's case, those early opportunities had been missed. A thorough investigation might have made the difference, but that window had long since closed, and with each passing year, the chances of solving the case grew slimmer. Still, the Houchin family refused to give up. Danielle's parents continued to push for justice, but every effort seemed to hit a dead end. Eventually, her younger sister stepped up, determined to carry the fight forward. She began speaking out in interviews, contacting investigators, and doing everything she could to make sure the case wasn't forgotten, and that one day, Danielle's killer would finally be found. In 2019, more than 2 decades after Danielle's death, her family finally succeeded in getting the investigation reopened. It was a long overdue step, but one that brought little immediate progress. The partial DNA sample was once again run through the FBI's national database, still with no matches. Revisiting the original list of suspects also led nowhere. With no new evidence and few leads to chase, the case once again stalled. Then, in 2021, there was a shift. A new sheriff took over the local department, and with him came a renewed sense of purpose. He had joined the force just days before Danielle disappeared, and had carried the weight of the case with him ever since. Like several officers back then, he had always believed her death was no accident. Now, for the first time, he had the authority to act on that belief, but the challenges were enormous. The trail was cold, and outside of the partial DNA sample recovered from Danielle's clothing, there was little to go on. Realizing the case needed fresh eyes and modern tools, the sheriff enlisted the help of 2 outside experts, a retired investigator from California turned private detective, and a DNA specialist with expertise in forensic genealogy. Their focus was narrow but critical: identify the source of the hair and biological material found on Danielle's underwear. They sent the evidence to a lab in California known for cutting-edge DNA analysis. Then, they waited for answers. In August 2023, while the testing was underway, Danielle's case was officially reclassified as a homicide. Nearly 27 years after her death, authorities finally acknowledged what her family had known all along. In early 2024, just a few months after the homicide reclassification, the lab in California reached out with an update. While they still hadn't identified the person behind the DNA sample, they had made a significant breakthrough. They had successfully extracted a complete DNA profile. It was a major step forward, offering investigators something they had never had in over 2 decades: a full genetic fingerprint of the likely perpetrator. With that, the team sent the profile to another lab in Virginia that specialized in genetic genealogy. Their hope was that this next phase could finally link the DNA to a name. Then came the wait. Several months passed before the call finally came. The Virginia lab explained that they had uploaded the DNA profile to public genetic databases, platforms where people voluntarily submit their DNA in search of relatives or ancestry information. These databases had been used to crack open many cold cases in recent years by building out family trees to identify suspects. But in this case, they didn't have to build anything. To everyone's surprise, they got an immediate, perfect match. The DNA belonged to a man who had willingly submitted his sample to the database, a rare occurrence in criminal investigations. His name was Paul Hutchinson, a 55-year-old man living in the small town of Dillon, roughly 100 miles from where Danielle was killed. Digging into his past, investigators found that in 1996, Hutchinson had been 27 years old and studying biology at the University of Montana, just 12 miles from Belgrade. He also worked for Montana's Bureau of Land Management and was married with 2 children. What stood out most was what wasn't there. Hutchinson had no criminal history, not a single prior offense. On paper, he was a family man with a respectable job and a clean record. With their suspect identified, investigators now needed one final piece of confirmation: a direct DNA sample. On July 23rd, they headed to Paul Hutchinson's workplace to make contact. As they arrived at the Bureau of Land Management office, they spotted him standing outside with a group of co-workers. The detectives approached and asked him to come down to the station for a few questions. They later recalled how his face visibly changed, the color drained, and his demeanor shifted immediately. Still, Hutchinson agreed to go with them. At the station, detectives took their time. They began by asking general questions about unsolved cases in the region. Initially, Hutchinson remained composed, but everything shifted the moment they placed a photo of Danielle Houchin in front of him. He became visibly distressed, sweating, scratching at his face, even biting at his hands. He struggled to stand and stumbled over a chair trying to get up. To the detectives, his reaction spoke volumes. It wasn't a confession, but it felt close. Despite his behavior, Hutchinson denied any involvement in Danielle's murder. But a confession wasn't necessary. Detectives collected a fresh DNA sample and sent it to the lab for testing. With no formal charges filed yet, they let him go, pending the results. Immediately after the interrogation, the detectives made a call Danielle's family had been waiting nearly 28 years to receive. They informed her sister that they had found Danielle's killer. They explained that although charges couldn't be filed just yet, they were confident the DNA test would confirm what they already knew. For her, it was a long-awaited sense of relief, and the first real step toward justice. She also knew this would mark the beginning of a lengthy legal process, but the case took an unexpected and tragic turn the very next day. On the morning the DNA results were due to arrive, Hutchinson called his local police station. He said he needed help, gave his location, and abruptly hung up. Responding officers found his car parked along the side of the road. Inside, they discovered Hutchinson's body, a gun lying next to him. He had taken his own life before the DNA results could be officially returned. In the aftermath of Paul Hutchinson's death, detectives closed the case with one firm conclusion: he had acted alone. There was no note left behind in the car, but the motive seemed obvious. Faced with the near certainty of life in prison, Hutchinson likely saw no way out. For his wife and children, the revelation was devastating. They had no idea what he had done nearly 3 decades earlier, and they hadn't even known he'd been questioned by police. The truth came out only after his death, and they learned about the accusations at the same time they were told he was gone. Friends and colleagues were equally stunned. Hutchinson had spent years building a reputation as a loyal friend and a dedicated family man. No one in his circle suspected anything darker in his past. But for detectives, there was no question about his guilt. In August 2024, investigators held a press conference to announce the results of the long-awaited DNA analysis. The findings were definitive. Hutchinson's DNA was a perfect match with the semen and hairs found on Danielle Houchin's underwear. They believed it had been a crime of opportunity. There was no evidence to suggest Danielle and Hutchinson knew each other. It appeared she had simply crossed his path near the trail that day, and in that moment, he chose to attack. To ensure she couldn't identify him, he killed her. For Danielle's family, the news of Hutchinson's death didn't bring sorrow. It brought a measure of closure. While he would never stand trial or serve a prison sentence, what troubled them more was knowing he had lived freely for nearly 30 years. He had started a family, built a career, and lived in peace, while they had endured years of unanswered questions and grief. They couldn't help but wonder, if the case had been taken seriously from the beginning, could justice have come decades earlier? In the days following the press conference, Hutchinson's wife reached out with a public statement. She offered her condolences to Danielle's family, making it clear that she neither defended nor excused her husband's actions. Share your thoughts on this story in the comment section. And don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe if you enjoyed this video. Thank you for watching.